Hello and welcome. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is more commonly called SANHS. I'm also chair of the Historic Buildings Committee of SANHS. We're sorry that we've had to cancel the actual walk round Dunster today, 1st of August, but this lecture is a substitute and it was organised by the Archaeological and Historic Buildings Committee. Today, we're going to hear a lecture by David Dawson about the old Pottery Kiln in Dunster. The lecture will be a first of a series by SANHS and will be recorded for future use. If you've any thoughts or queries about the lecture, you can send in questions by activating the questions and answer button, the Q&A button at the bottom of the page and typing in a message. To find the button, just run your mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top right or even hidden under 3 dots. At the end of the lecture, I will field any interesting questions to David and he'll be able to respond. Any questions submitted will go on record in the recording, but we won't mention your names for privacy reasons. If you're enjoying the lecture, which is free, you might want to give a donation to SANHS. The donations button is on the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society website homepage. A link to the donations button will be posted on the chat button, that's like the Q&A button but next door, at the end of the lecture. The chat button can be found at the bottom or under the 3 dots menu somewhere. So our lecture today is by David Dawson, who is, amongst other things, a specialist in post-medieval pottery, particularly in Somerset. He worked with Ollie Kent on the Bickley Ceramics project near Bristol for over 30 years, and they became specialists in kiln technology. The lecture, as I said, was originally designed as a walk round Dunster, but because of the COVID situation, this hasn't been possible. So part of the lecture today will show films of Dunster, which we hope will put the kiln into context. So over to David.
Thank you, Lizzie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry we're not out in the fresh air, enjoying a walk round Dunster, but at least we hope that you will be able to make the journey yourself and see the kinds of things that we're talking about this afternoon. So let's transport ourselves to Dunster with the first bit of film. This is the view looking down from the ball down towards the castle you see there in the background. Castle was built in the time of the conquest by the Moon family, and the main motte, the central mound, is actually covered in trees, with the newer buildings. Those that you see here are built by Salvin in the mid-19th century and by the side of it. In front of us we have the sweep of High Street, which is, if you see, is a wide marketplace and was built as such. It's almost certainly this part of the new settlement was added to a Saxon settlement that is off on the right-hand side. And you'll see that on either side you've got houses that go back with long plots at right angles to the market street itself. And there in the middle is the yarn market. A reminder that Dunster was once the principal market for the textile industry in this part of the world, and remains so really up until about the time of the Civil War. That large building that you see on the left-hand side is the Lateral Arms, which was originally built as the guest house for the abbots of Cleve, just along the coast, for their clients attending the fair. And if we move further left, you can see that behind those cottages where the road rises up to the crest of a hill, which is where that red car's gone past, round to the left, sharp left there, was the original lane that led down to Dunster Horn, the harbour of the medieval town. There's been a new road cut through called Dunster Steep, and the little arch building that you see in front of you dates from that time. It's one of the outhouse buildings to the Luttrell Arms that was erected in the 19th century. Just behind it, hidden by a tree, you can see, and this is what it looked like back last winter, you can see quite clearly there's the whitewash shape of a pottery kiln poking up above the roof level. And it is that peculiar little building that I would like to concentrate on this afternoon. So if we take ourselves round the back of what is now the Exmoor National Park Visitor Centre, go through the wicket gate from the car park, and up behind there we stand on this hill. The kiln is behind us. We're looking out again over the castle. We're standing on what was probably, although a natural eminence, was enhanced to take a battery of guns during the Civil War when the castle was besieged. Now behind those trees, what you can't see very well is the flat river valley of the Avon, which is where the old deer park was laid out. And indeed right here where we're standing now is on the northeastern fringe of that park. And as we swing round, you can see the map. This hillock is actually dropping down towards the river, just about between that row of white cottages, which marks the site of the old lane down to the Horn, and the new buildings in front of us, which marks the steep. You can just see the Bristol Channel. It's about 1.5 miles away, but you'll have to imagine that was once a busy highway. It's the pre-20th century version of the M5. There's been a huge amount of shipping going not only up and down it, but across it as well. And if we swing round further to the left here, we can see the Pottery Kiln. And above it, peeking out through the trees, is Conica Tower. The tower itself was completed in 1770, but we know it was being built at the same time that the pottery house in the park was being built, and in particular the Pottery Kiln. The excellent documentation that has come down to us it makes it very clear that this kiln was built in 1759, when John and Ruth Mogg were brought down from Bristol for this particular purpose of building the pottery. Now the kiln and the pottery are all part of a much bigger scheme that was designed by Henry Fownes Luttrell. He married the heiress, Margaret, and as a condition of that marriage, he had to spend 6 months of the year in Dunster. That time he put to good use. He wanted to spend a lot of time changing the park. At one stage, he even extended the deer park and arranged for his deer to be driven over from his other park at Marshwood to stock it. But he did many other things as well. The way the River Avon is landscaped around the gardens at the foot of the castle hill, the bridge and the new gristmill down there are all part of his grand scheme. And he commissioned a record of all this. Here we can see on this map just quickly where the pottery is. You can see the Horn up on the right hand side there, all silted up now. And that is one of the reasons why the Luttrells commissioned a new quay to be built at Minehead, so that the waterborne trade of the town could still continue. And the Luttrells had a day boat that regularly sailed between Minehead and Bristol for bringing in all those supplies that they required, including those, incidentally, for running the pottery. You can also see on this map here where the old Saxon settlement was in relation to the new town that we have set out between the pottery and the castle. Now, one of the reasons we were brought, I came and with my colleague Ollie Kent into contact with this peculiar little monument. It's known incidentally locally as the Bell House, although it is marked on older Ordnance Survey maps as being a pottery kiln. This is the state it was in 1989, when Hilary Binding, who many of you will know, was well known as a local historian for Dunster and this area of West Somerset, wrote extensively in Exmoor Review, for example. She asked us to have a look at it and see if it really was a pottery kiln. Well, our first job was to give it a haircut. As you can see, it is very overgrown here. It was being used at the time by the Luttrell Arms, in whose grounds it actually then stood, as a furniture store, a place to keep all the garden furniture while it was not in use over the winter. Now, cleaning that monument off left us with this beautiful little structure that you see here. Now, it is part of a bigger complex, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. As you can see here, what it appeared like after the National Park had taken it over to become a Scheduled Ancient Monument. It was conserved by Sarah Pennell, who made a magnificent job of repairing it. And you can see that it's had to be re-lime washed several times since to keep the weather out. But it's still there as very much as it was probably first intended. Now, I have to say, this is a record taken in 1768 by a local artist, William Tomkin. And you can see very clearly this funny little building. It's only a detail, incidentally. Conica Tower up on its hill, then actually incomplete. But you can see this little complex of buildings. And on the right-hand side, that you can see from the little buildings that extend there, quite clearly is the outline of the pottery kiln that we can see today. The rest of the house has gone. But this is almost certainly the pottery house in the old Deer Park, for which John and Ruth Mogg, in answer to an advertisement placed in the Western Flying Post of 1759, they came down here to establish, and they were given the job of establishing the pottery. It is quite distinct. It has been sometimes confused with the job that was advertised at the same time, and that was for managing the brickworks. Now, the brickworks is all the way down in the Warren, and you'll know the Warren better now as Butlins Pleasure Park, or whatever they call it, Holiday Park. But I must emphasize that these are two completely separate functions. Why put a pottery here? It's a daft place to put a pottery. The records make plain that absolutely everything that was required to make this run, clay, lead for glazes, and even water, had to be brought up to the site. It couldn't have functioned in any other way. Now, the only reason, and unfortunately this is the one thing that the documents do not say, they may go down to the terrific detail of the number of moles caught in the lawn at Dunster Castle, but the one thing they never do is actually say the reasons why Henry Fowles Luttrell did things. He obviously was there to beautify his park, and Ollie Kent and I are convinced that this was an attempt to animate the landscape. It's all very well having a park that was beautiful with ornamental bridges and all the rest of it, but in the end, as Walpole recommended incidentally in his treatise in the 1780s, in the end you needed to add that interest of animating the landscape. Now it is true that from the castle principal rooms you had a fantastic view of the Bristol Channel, and that in those days of course would have been dotted with the lights of vessels making their way up and down it and across it. But how much more interesting would it have been to have a pottery actually working in the landscape, which meant at certain times, probably at weekends, the kiln could be seen working. The red glow of firing pots could be seen from the castle. There's a good reason for doing the ends of firings of kilns at the end of the day, and that is that you can see the colour better. And it is by the colour as much as the sound of the kiln firing and the way in which the fire is inside is behaving, and the little spy holes that you can see into the kiln to see what's happening to the ware. It is the colour that actually gives you so much information if you are used to firing a pottery kiln. Now, just to help explain, let's look at a diagram that my colleague Ollie Kent drew. You can find this in the leaflet that Exmoor National Park Authority have published, incidentally, and it's also available online. You can see in the credits at the end of the programme. The house that you see on the left was almost certainly used as a potter's dwelling house by John and Ruth. Their workshops were almost certainly part of the ground floor of that and part of the extension that you see there. The lean-tos on either side of the kiln probably had two major functions. One was to store the fuel that would have been required during the firing, and the second is that it afforded a nice place for putting up racks in which you could dry the ware while it was waiting. It needed to be really as dry as possible before you committed it to loading in the kiln. Now the kiln that you see in the centre there has a central doorway that you've seen from the outside. Now that would have been bricked up when the kiln was being fired. You'll notice the kiln has two fireboxes, one by the chap there on the right, and we've sectioned the one on the left here so that you can see quite clearly this was designed for firing coal. It has a grate on which the coal fire was placed, and coal needs an awful lot of air for it to burn efficiently. And it also produces ash, which then can, and clinker, which then can drop through into the ash pit beneath. Now that fire will be over the course of a day or so, will reach a temperature of getting on for over 900 degrees centigrade, which is quite hot. The ware chamber is where the pots would have been stacked before firing started. They would have literally been piled one on top of each other until they reached almost to the roof. The roof, you see, is actually a brick vault. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And you'll see it has got perforations in it to let the hot air and gases come right up through it. Now the function of that little conical chimney, which incidentally has lost a little bit of its top, probably about a foot or so, the function of that is to help enhance the draw. way in which the flame is actually pulled through the ware and out to the top. We have 4 little arches on either side, you notice on either side of the gable there, and those are for allowing the firemen to get up there and make adjustments to the way in which the fires are drawing. By pushing tiles over the perforations you see there, it is actually possible, if the kiln isn't drawing evenly, to try and even up that firing through moving the tiles in or out of the way as appropriate. Now, a kiln like this would have been started firing, if tradition is to be believed, normally started firing the evening before. Now, when I say firing, I don't mean shoveling in coal like firing a locomotive on the local railway. I mean just starting a very gentle fire, because the first job in this kind of kiln is to actually warm the kiln up and to dry the pottery properly. Now, to do that, you mustn't let, certainly not flame, get in amongst the ware. You want, if possible, to keep the temperature at or about the boiling point of water. That way, the pottery can let off the water that's still within it. It will not only have water that was soaked in it while it was being thrown, but it will also have what potters call the water combination, the water that's actually combined in the clay, and that needs to be let out gradually by the gentle heat. The reason, well, otherwise, if you go hard at it, if you throw a lump of clay into a fire, chances are it's going to spit and splatter and fall into lots of different pieces. And that's because the water inside it has been turned to steam and has exploded it, basically. So we can imagine then our potters getting up, having spent a good week or so getting the load together for this. And it looks as though they took about, from the firing pattern that one can reconstruct from the accounts, it looks as though it took about a fortnight to get together enough pottery to fill this kiln. They would have started this process the night before, and perhaps they even not themselves, but to keep themselves fresh, they perhaps paid a villager. There's a record of the potters of Verwood actually getting one of the gentlemen of the road to come in return for a good meal and a nice warm place to sleep off the following day. They arranged for somebody like that to come in and just keep the fire gently going all the way through the night. And then you get up bright and early the following morning, fresh as a daisy, and you set to with firing this kiln. It would have taken almost certainly a day. I'm not too sure with this particular size of kiln. It may have taken a little bit longer, but certainly a day before you could actually get it right up to temperature, right up to that 900 degrees centigrade, and holding it there for a while to allow the glazes to melt and the pottery to turn into proper red earthenware. Before then, you could just let it die, the fires die down, and the kiln to start to cool down. It might be just about cool enough to, when you broke the door down the following midday, to whiz in and start unpacking it. I guess with actually this kiln, because they would be slightly more relaxed about it than they would with urban potteries. They probably decided to give it a day to cool down properly so they could start taking the ware out, unfettling it and stacking it up and putting it ready for sale. So that'll give you an idea. Number of people employed in this, probably no more really than John and Ruth Mogg themselves. They were the people who formed the hardcore of the workforce here. They may well have had employed the odd person to keep the fires going overnight, they may well have employed the odd lad from the local town to help turn the wheel, to help with throwing. But it would have been a very, very small scale operation. Now, unfortunately, we know that John died around about November in 1760. And Ruth carried on. It's quite normal for ladies to carry on businesses in those days. Nothing exceptional about it at all. But in the end, she gave in a notice and left in December that year. And the following year, we find that Henry Fowles Luttrell is advertising again for somebody to come and take over. And this time it was a John Norris who came down, not from Bristol like John and Ruth, but he came from the fairly well-known Somerset pottery at Donyat. Now, what he made of this kiln, I'm not sure. It would have been probably almost certainly completely new technology for him, but one which no doubt he was willing to set to and master. So that then give you a little bit of background to this lovely structure. You can see here the way in which a gabled roof is abutted. This side of the kiln, this is the east side. You can see 2 of the 4 openings which give into the kiln itself from the outside here. You will note the fireboxes, incidentally, have been covered by the ground level outside. And inside, the floor level has been taken down by about half. The junction between the stonework and the brickwork that you see marks the original level of the floor. Beneath it, we have this labyrinth of flues that will have distributed the heat from the 2 fireboxes on either side. We know the fire bars have been removed, but we know that they were coal-fired because there is the ledges for the fire bars to fit on. You can see incidentally there the way that there's been a meltdown, which is probably one of the reasons why the kiln was never properly repaired. There's the vault. You see it's made of concentric rows of bricks placed vertically, with the odd one missing to provide the perforations for drawing the hot air out above. And this is the view you get by peering in through the doorway. What did they make? Well, fortunately, when the pottery was abandoned for demolition around about the 1860s, which is when the road was built, new road, Dunster Steep was built to join the new turnpike, and the Luttrell Arms extended its outhouses and dug into the hillside behind the kiln. They, during the demolition work, obviously they found a whole load of green pottery that's never been fired. And they used that to fill the labyrinth that you've just seen and level it up so they could just simply lay an earth floor on top of that, a level earth floor. Because of that, we were able to rescue parts of this green pottery and have been able to reconstruct a range of the vessels that were left abandoned at that time. And Ollie Kent has reconstructed what they look like on the left-hand side here. The big pot at the back is almost somewhere around about a metre, getting on for a metre in diameter. So you can see these are big pots ranging round down to the size of bowls that we've got, even a cup that we've got in the foreground here. Cup would have been about 6 inches, whatever that is in metric, in diameter. Now, although we have no actual pots made at Dunster that we've been able to identify as surviving, the pots that you see here on the right, which is actually made in the East Somerset potteries about the same time. The East Somerset potteries extended from Nunney down to Wanstrow through Truddock's Hill. They supplied the Bristol market through a different route. As you can see here, exactly the same kind of pot that you can see here on the left, a lidded and spouted jar. You'll notice it, like all the pots on the left-hand side here, would have been glazed internally. Plain lead glaze, which has fired this lovely rich brown, speckled brown colour. And you can see that quite clearly this would have been a jar that was designed for storage, hence the lid. Big heavy rim to enable you to lift it up when full and cart it around. But also the rim provided a way in which you could put a cloth over the top and fasten it down, tie it down, to stop things like weevils getting inside. Because the whole purpose of these big pots was for food storage. Food storage back in the days before refrigerators and supermarkets and all that stuff that we have these days. It was to fill your larder to provide secure storage for all those foodstuffs, both liquid and solid, that you would have required to keep going through the winter. That included, incidentally, salting hams, and there are evidence of similar pots being used and filled with isinglass, which is a way of preserving eggs over a long period of time. So every cottage, every household would have had its supply of these big pots. For many of the poorer households, of course, they would have required on red earthenware like this, which incidentally is described in the accounts as being coarse pottery ware. They would have relied on things like the bowls and the cups that you see down on the left here for their ordinary tableware. So that'll give you an idea of what was being made here. And no doubt somewhere around there will be pots that we have yet to identify that were made in this kiln. Now, being archaeologists, one likes to be able to get as good a record as possible of the buildings that one is studying. And just in the fairly recent years, over the last 5 years, the technique of laser scanning has given us the opportunity to record structures like this in far greater detail than would be normal through photogrammetry even, let alone drawing. Unless you happen to be as skilled as some of those 19th century architects who seem to produce beautiful drawings at a drop of a hat. So our next best thing is by using this scanning technology. And this is my colleague Bill Stebbing of Scan to Plan. With the permission of the Exmoor National Park Authority, we surveyed the kiln last year. Now, what it means, for example, is that you can see the kiln, as you see here on the right-hand side, is the reconstructed from all these different laser scans and images, the reconstructed view of the back of the kiln, which you normally can't see except by peering out of a window in the back of the Exmoor National Park Visitor Centre, which you, of course, can do if you wish. But it's actually quite difficult to get from that viewpoint an idea of what it looks like square on. And this we've been able to reproduce here on the right. And if you go you can approach these in any way you wish. We produced here on the right a cross section which shows quite clearly the way in which the kiln has survived to this day. You can see incidentally by the doorway, the door head, and up through the cone, the way in which the kiln has cracked has actually subsided very slightly down on the left-hand side. It's almost certainly happened during the time when the excavation of the hillside was taking place to build what is now the National Park Visitor Centre. This has been part of Sarah Pennell's job as conservator, was to carefully stitch these cracks together. They're not moving. We've had several structural engineers have a good look at this. It's not moving. We could be quite happy that it's now secure. The kiln's gone a bit, the kiln chimney has gone a bit wonky as a result, but it's perfectly safe now. And indeed, Sarah has put a lead lid on the top to keep out the weather. On the left here, though, you can see how it is possible using this technology to produce an accurate idea of the labyrinth that we were looking at just now. Fireboxes on either side. The one on the right, incidentally, has been blocked completely with new walling. The one on the left was backfilled with debris, including roof tiles exactly the same as the ones on top of the National Park Centre, but also some transfer printed wares which are very closely dated to around about 1860. Above that you can see the plan of all those little holes in the roof through which the draft of the kiln was drawn up into the chimney. So you can see how this technique can actually provide you with a lot of information much more readily than any other means. So that leaves us then with this amazing structure. I say it's amazing, it's almost certainly the earliest standing pottery kiln in Britain. Ollie Kent and I keep on saying this, and nobody has shown that we are wrong. It is amazing because not only because of what it is, but because of the documentation, the detailed documentation that goes with it, which explains how it was built, the circumstances of its being built, and the firing cycles, the 7 firing cycles that John and Ruth Mogg took it through to produce pottery. It is also remarkable that it is recorded in that painting of 1768. So we can be confident that this is the actual structure that John and Ruth Mogg had come down to Bristol to build in 1759. So this is really, really special.
Well, thank you, David. That was really interesting. We haven't got any questions yet, so anybody who's watching, and I know there are people out there watching, any ideas or anything you think that David might be able to say that you might have missed out on, do type them in and I'll be able to field them all to David. Naturally, I had lots of questions because I find it a particularly interesting subject, and I was wondering, how much trade did they do with Bristol?
We don't know.
You don't know? No idea, even though there were all those records being kept?
No, because they just keep a record of the value of the pots sold.
Right.
And from that, I think one can speculate fairly confidently that most of the pottery was for local consumption.
Mm. And another thing I'd love to know, you say that is it Mr. and Mrs. Mogg, Ruth and husband, came down from Bristol. Were they making pots like Bristol pots? You know, had they been learning their trade up in Bristol, do you think?
There is no record of them amongst all the copious records of Bristol potters. There is no record of them in Bristol. So one's not, although they came down from Bristol to take the job, one is not sure about where they learnt their trade. Now, I think there are 2 factors that make it likely that they learnt their trade in Bristol. One is the kiln itself. It is a fairly remarkable, sophisticated design for the mid-18th century. That kind of a bottle kiln, really, is what it is, an early bottle kiln, is only tends to be known from places like the big industrial centres like Bristol, and the great industrial centre at that time, of course, was the potteries in Staffordshire. The second thing is form. Yes, they are West Country forms of pans, but one shouldn't get too excited about that because there is a fairly limited constraint on the kinds of forms you're producing. There's a wide range of forms there, but there are forms that are being actually produced in a number of redware potteries all over Britain at the time.
Yeah, so there's just a certain similarity then to the Bristol pots.
Yes, but bearing in mind that there wasn't a redware industry in Bristol at that time.
Oh, right.
Well, at least one hasn't been, it was probably just about starting. Kai Mason's done some very interesting research on Bristol redware potteries, but they do seem to be very late. And the reason almost certainly is that in the 18th century, most of their red courseware was coming from the East Somerset potteries that I mentioned just now. Earlier than that, we know from the archaeological excavations in Bristol, they were coming mostly from West Somerset, but this is the potteries around Netherstowe and Rangway, and all that group of potteries that are strung out along the western side of the Quantock Hills and the Brendans.
Do you suppose they were using Dunster as a port for that?
Yes, but most Bridgewater was the main port.
Okay, thank you. But we've got some, sorry.
That's the easiest one, partly because it's at the mouth of the Tone, and all these potteries led that way, apart from Netherstowe, which of course is much easier because it's that side of the Quantock. And we have documentary evidence there that Bob Dunning unearthed some years ago, shows quite clearly that there are potters in certainly Overstowe who have property in Bridgewater. So it's almost certainly going out through Bridgewater.
Right. Well, we've got some questions come in now, which is good. Somebody would like to know, where did the coal come from?
There are two possibilities. Probably the most likely is from South Wales. The advert that I mentioned that brought John and Ruth Mogg down was actually advertising a post of the brickworks as well, and for that it specifically said somebody who was used to using Welsh coal. Now, of course, Welsh coal was brought in quantity to the south coast of the Bristol Channel because it was used in lime burning. Got lime kilns in every single port up and down the coast because, of course, lime was needed to enrich the agricultural use of the land. Used extensively. So there were tons coming in that way. They're obviously bringing in coal for the brickworks. Now, the only slight doubt I have about using the same coal for the kiln is that usually for pottery firing, you need a special kind of coal, one that has a long flame. And I'm not sure at that time whether that type of coal was being exploited in South Wales. You can use any old coal for producing lime. Potters are a bit more fussy. Now, it is a small size of kiln. There is a possibility that because the estate obviously had a boat going up to Bristol at such regular intervals, and because John and Ruth Mogg were probably trained in Bristol, they may well have asked for Bristol coal to be brought down, especially as well. If there's a boat going backwards and forwards, it wouldn't have made very much difference. Of course, in the mid-18th century, there were the coal fields in Bristol themselves were very much being used, open cast over on the east side of Bristol, just the main railway line to South Wales.
Okay, brilliant. We've got another one here. When did the kiln stop being used?
Probably, well, certainly in the early 19th century, because after Henry Fowles Luttrell's death, the documentation doesn't carry on. It's probably sometime around about 1840, certainly by 1860 when the works were done.
Yeah. Okay. And question here: was the pottery sold to the public, or was it even used up at the big house up at the castle?
Oh, almost certainly, it was all used for, or certainly most of it was used for local consumption. But unfortunately, we've got names of people it was sold to. We know that Ruth Mogg actually sold pots straight from the site, because we've got receipts of what she actually sold. So you could have turned up at the pottery and asked for a dozen of those nice earthenware bowls. So it was almost certainly that also found their way up into the castle as well, where of course there were extensive need for larder facilities, and those are just the kind of pots. But there aren't any there, unfortunately. We've had a look. I've got a feeling that when Mr. Salvin moved in to rebuild the castle, all the old pots were slung out. So maybe there, somewhere in the grounds, there's a nice pile of
I bet they're in the pottery ditch, in the castle ditch somewhere.
Yeah, one hopes.
Well, that would be fun, yeah. And, oh, lovely question here. You said that the kiln was built particularly to animate the landscape, but did it actually make money?
I think the answer must be from the accounts, because Ruth Mogg went away owing money. Now, I have to say the way that owing was worked out was a little dubious. I think that if it broke, it probably just about broke even, actually.
It must have been incredibly hard work for her running that pottery on her own. I mean, looking at the size of those pots, she must have been incredibly strong to be able to lift them all the way up the hill to load the kiln.
Well, don't forget the pottery was just next door, so it was only a matter of lifting the kiln. And almost certainly she would have had somebody to help her. She would have hired in somebody. To load the kiln like that, you need at least 2 people.
Yeah. Yeah, quite fantastic, really, aren't they? I'm trying to think of something else. Sorry, David.
You know, incidentally, I remarked that there was be nothing unusual about somebody like Ruth carrying on the business after her husband's death. There are quite a number of examples that are well documented of such a thing happening. One thinks, for example, of Elizabeth Ring in Bristol. She was working about the same time, actually. Her husband had an accident. In fact, part of the wall of the pottery fell down, collapsed upon him, and he died shortly afterwards. Now, she carried on running the pottery for a little while, for selling out to other partners. The one thing she did do was to carry on after that, actually running the shop. So if you wanted fine white earthenware in Bristol in the 1760s, you went to Elizabeth Ring. So there are plenty of she's just one example, but I think there are plenty of examples of that kind of thing happening. Which means that one mustn't, a partnership like John and Ruth Mogg would have been a true business partnership as well as being a marriage. There would be, they were almost be interchangeable in their skills.
It's a lovely idea, isn't it? Yes, the good old 18th century when women were almost equal. Okay, well, thank you. That was great. Somebody would like to know, is the kiln open to visit?
The inside is blocked off with a gate, an open gate, which is padlocked. But you can peer through the bars. It is perfectly publicly accessible. If you park in the steep car park at the bottom there, go through the wicket gate just by the side of the shops, you can scramble up the bank, and there it is, on top of the hill. The other way of getting at it is to scramble up from the National Trust car park and follow the boundary wall of the bottom of the tenements, the burgage plots, and you'll find it at the top there.
Yeah, lovely. And one last question. I think, did the kiln work all the year round, or was it a seasonal thing?
No, it would have. We know it would have worked all year round. In fact, it only worked for about when it's documented, it's only worked for a few months. But it would have been the kind of thing that would have worked all year round. There's no point in making it seasonal at all.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I think that's about it for today. Thank you very much, David. So, at the end of September, there'll be an update event about Early Dunster project. This is what would have been held in the Tithe Barn, but it'll now be an online, another online lecture. The SANHS Early Dunster project is sponsored by Historic England and has been running for the last 2 years, investigating features of many early buildings in Dunster. We plan to have a series of 4 lectures. They'll include talks by timber frame crook expert Nat Olcock and church archaeology expert Jerry Sampson, and other members of the Dunster team talking about the progress to date on the project. There also, to go with this, will be an online exhibition with video extracts. The event will be spread over about a month, and it will start on Saturday the 26th of September. And registration in advance, as we did today. There will be further information about these events on the SANHS website, Somerset Archaeology and Natural History Society, and also on the Society's Facebook page. Don't forget, we've got a donations button hidden underneath the chat button on your computer. And I think that's about it for today. Hope to see you again sometime, and thank you for joining us. Goodbye.